Hello there, my Vampire Diaries fans. Tonight, we journey through the complete story of the Vampire Diaries. From the ancient darkness that created the first vampires over 1,000 years ago, through the secrets buried beneath a small Virginia town, and through the bonds of love and loyalty that will be tested by death itself. This is the story of monsters who learn to feel, of humans who learn to survive, and of a town that carried the weight of 1,000 years of tragedy beneath its quiet, ordinary streets. So get yourself settled in. Close your eyes and let Mystic Falls and all its beautiful broken souls carry you gently into rest. Before Mystic Falls had a name, before the roads were laid and the founding families built their grand houses on land, they believed they had claimed through will and through industry the story that would eventually consume Elena Gilbert and the Salvatore brothers and every supernatural creature caught in the orbit of that small Virginia town had already been unfolding for 1,000 years, rooted in a grief so total and so consuming that a mother had been willing to break the laws of nature itself rather than endure the weight of losing one more child to a world that had already taken too much from her. The Mikkelsen family came from Scandinavia, from a village pressed against the cold edge of the world, where the winters were long and the land was hard, and survival required the kind of endurance that softened nothing in a person, but only made them more thoroughly what they already were. Mikkel was a warrior and a patriarch whose pride ran as deep as his capacity for cruelty. A man who loved his family in the way that some men love their possessions. Fiercely and without flexibility, and with a violence that emerged whenever what he loved failed to behave as he believed it should. Esther was a witch of genuine power. Her gifts inherited through a lineage that stretched back through generations of women who had understood that nature was not simply the world around them, but the world within them. A force to be respected and negotiated with, rather than commanded or overridden without consequence. They had children together, several of them, and among those children was a boy named Henrik, who possessed the kind of open and wondering spirit that made everyone around him love him, without effort or without calculation. The sort of child whose presence made a home feel warmer simply by occupying it. It was Henrik's death that broke something fundamental in the Mikkelsen family, something that had perhaps already been fragile, but that his loss shattered entirely and left the pieces lying in arrangements that could never be reassembled into the shape they had held before. He was killed by werewolves on a night when he and his brother Niklas had crept out together to watch the wolves transform beneath the full moon. The fascination of young boys with dangerous things leading them into proximity with creatures that did not distinguish between curious children and genuine threats. The village the Michaelsons had settled in was not in Scandinavia, but in the New World, a place they had migrated to in search of land that was abundant and a life that was free from the pressures and the conflicts that had worn them down in the place where they had begun. The land they settled on was extraordinary in ways they could not fully articulate, but could feel in the way that people with supernatural sensitivity feel the presence of power that runs beneath the surface of ordinary things. The earth itself carried something ancient and something significant, a convergence of forces that made magic perform there more potent and made the consequences of that magic more permanent and more far-reaching than any witch could fully anticipate when she began to work. It was on this land, after Henrik's death, that Esther made the choice that would alter the course of human and supernatural history for the next millennium. She had a friend and a mentor named Iona, a witch of considerable wisdom who understood what Esther was contemplating and who refused to assist in it, not because she lacked compassion for Esther's grief, but because she could see with the clarity that wisdom provides what the consequences would be and what nature would do in response to having its fundamental order violated through magic that circumvented death rather than accepting it. Iona's refusal did not stop Esther, whose grief had moved beyond the reach of wisdom and whose love for her remaining children had become indistinguishable from her fear of losing them. The spell Esther cast drew on the power of the land beneath her, on the blood of her children, on a white oak tree that had stood on that convergent ground long enough to absorb the concentrated power of the earth's supernatural nature, and on the sun itself, which she bound into the magic as both weapon and vulnerability. She called it a gift. She called it protection. She offered her children wine laced with blood and asked Mikkel to run each of them through with his sword so that the death and the subsequent feeding on human blood would trigger the transition that would make them something more than human and something that could not be easily killed by the wolves or the other dangers that had already taken Henrik from them. What emerged from that ritual was the first generation of vampires, Mikkel, and their children Klaus and Elijah and Rebecca and Finn and Cole. Each of them transformed into something that retained their personalities and their memories and their capacity for love and for hatred. But that added to all of those things a hunger that was insatiable and a strength that made them dangerous in ways they had not yet learned to control. The hunger arrived with a violence that none of them had been prepared for. The thirst for human blood, immediate and overwhelming and utterly indifferent to the relationships and the moral commitments that existed in the human parts of them, that the transformation had not erased. The sun burned their skin until Esther created daylight rings that allowed them to walk in light. They could not enter homes without invitation. Their power grew with age, making them progressively more formidable and progressively more difficult to destroy through ordinary means. But the magic had a flaw at its center, as magic drawn from nature always does when it is used to circumvent nature's intentions rather than to work in harmony with them. The white oak tree that had provided the power for the transformation also represented the one vulnerability that could kill an original vampire permanently. White oak wood through the heart meant true death, the kind from which even a 1,000-year-old vampire could not recover. Esther burned the tree to close that vulnerability, though she could not undo the power already contained in white oak that had been carved into weapons before the burning. Weapons that would resurface across the centuries at precisely the moments when someone needed them most. There was another flaw, more personal and more devastating in its immediate consequences. Niklaus, the one the family called Klaus, was not Mikhail's biological son, but the son of a werewolf chieftain with whom Esther had been involved before her marriage, a secret she had kept through the years of their life in the New World, and that the transformation now threatened to expose. When Klaus made his first kill, and the werewolf gene that he had inherited from his true father activated alongside his new vampire nature, Esther acted quickly and without consulting him to bind his werewolf side through a spell that prevented the hybrid nature from ever fully expressing itself. She used the moonstone and an elaborate curse to lock away half of who her son was, and she justified it to herself as protection when it was in truth concealment. The erasure of evidence of her own transgression pressed into the body of a child who had not chosen his own nature and had not been asked whether he consented to have part of himself sealed away in darkness. Mikhail's discovery of Klaus's true parentage destroyed whatever remained of the family's fragile coherence. His rage at Esther's betrayal transformed into a cruelty directed at Klaus that was merciless and that was relentless, and that would eventually drive Klaus to an act of violence that could not be undone. The killing of his own mother, not in her physical form, but through the body of a witch she had possessed. When Klaus finally learned the full truth of what she had done to him and why she had done it. Mikhail's response to the death of Esther was not grief, but obsession. The transformation of a cruel father into something more purely dangerous. A hunter who turned all of his formidable strength and all of his vampire power toward the singular purpose of destroying the son he had never truly claimed as his own. The white oak tree was ash, and the first vampires were loose in the world, and the consequences of one mother's grief on one dark night in a village that no longer existed would not finish unfolding for another 1,000 years. The 1,000 years that followed the creation of the first vampires were not years of triumph or of peace, or of the safety that Esther had imagined she was purchasing for her children through the violation of nature's most fundamental boundary. They were years of running and of hiding and of building lives in new places, only to abandon those lives when Mikhail found them again, his pursuit relentless and his hatred for Klaus specifically so consuming that it had become the organizing principle of his entire existence across 10 centuries of immortal life that he used for nothing except the singular obsession of destroying the son who was not his son and who had killed the woman who had betrayed him. The siblings learned early that the world they had been made to survive in was not made easier by their power, but only made more complicated, because power attracted enemies as readily as it attracted followers, and because the hunger that came with their nature meant that every human community they entered was simultaneously a source of sustenance and a source of danger when feeding became uncontrolled, and when the evidence of what they were became impossible to conceal from people who had not yet learned that monsters were real and were living among them. The early years were the most disorienting. The transition from human experience to vampire existence, requiring adjustments that went far beyond learning to manage the thirst or learning to move through the world without revealing their nature to the humans around them. each of the siblings had been a specific kind of person before the transformation, with specific temperaments and specific dreams and specific understandings of what their lives were supposed to contain. And the transformation had not erased those personalities, but had amplified them in ways that made everything more extreme and more difficult to moderate through the ordinary social mechanisms that humans use to keep their impulses within acceptable limits. The emotions were larger and more consuming, the anger more dangerous, the love more absolute, the grief more permanent, because the passage of time that dulled human pain did not operate the same way in vampire psychology, where memories retained their original sharpness indefinitely, and where loss did not fade, but only accumulated across centuries of continued existence. Elijah was the one who held them together across those centuries with a combination of genuine moral conviction and exhausting patience that neither his circumstances nor his nature fully explained. The kind of integrity that seemed to exist in him as a fundamental quality of character, rather than as a product of his upbringing or his experience in a family where integrity had not been consistently modeled or consistently rewarded. He believed in redemption with a sincerity that the evidence of 1,000 years had not managed to extinguish, and he believed in Klaus specifically with a devotion that absorbed betrayal after betrayal without abandoning the underlying conviction that his brother was something more than what his worst moments demonstrated. He negotiated with enemies on Klaus's behalf, and he cleaned up the wreckage that Klaus left behind him, and he made promises to people who needed to believe that someone in the Mikkelsen family was trustworthy, and he kept those promises at enormous personal cost, because his word was the one thing he had decided centuries ago would remain constant regardless of what everything else around him became. This belief cost Elijah enormously across the centuries, and the cost was paid repeatedly and was paid willingly, which was either the greatest love the show would ever portray or the saddest form of denial. And the answer to that question changed depending on which century you were examining and which version of Klaus you encountered in it. Klaus himself was the most contradictory figure in a family that contained no simple people, his cruelty and his genuine capacity for love existing in the same body, without apparent awareness of their incompatibility, his rage at having been denied half his nature, expressing itself outward in violence and manipulation, rather than inward in the kind of reflection that might eventually have led to something resembling peace. His werewolf side was locked away, but it was not silent. The suppressed nature pushing against its boundaries in ways that manifested as volatility and as the particular desperation of someone who has never been allowed to be entirely themselves, and who has compensated for that incompleteness by accumulating power and by eliminating anything that threatened to expose the vulnerability beneath the performance. The artists he patronized, and the cities he built relationships with, and the rare individuals he allowed himself to genuinely care for all existed alongside the bodies of the people he had destroyed when they had disappointed him or defied him, or simply reminded him of his own limitations, and he moved between these two registers of his existence without apparent recognition that they were in contradiction, because 1,000 years of practice had made the contradiction feel like simply the way things were rather than a wound that had never been properly addressed. He turned vampires from his bloodline across the centuries, creating progeny who were sired to him through a bond that was not simply loyalty, but was something biological and compulsive, a supernatural devotion that his bloodline carried in their veins along with his venom, and that meant that every vampire he created became both a resource and a responsibility, whether he acknowledged the responsibility or not. The sire bond was another form of the same pattern that defined all of Klaus's relationships, the conversion of free beings into dependent ones, the mistaking of need for love and of control for connection, and it stretched across centuries and across continents as the vampires he turned others, and as the bloodline expanded into a network of supernatural beings whose fates were linked to his continued existence, whether they knew his name or not. Rebecca wanted only what she had always wanted, and what she was never permitted to keep for more than a handful of years at a time before Klaus destroyed it out of jealousy, or out of calculation, or out of the particular possessiveness that masqueraded as love in the Mikkelsen family, across generations of being told that love meant never leaving, and never choosing anything above the person who claimed to love you. She fell in love repeatedly across the centuries, with humans and with vampires and with men who saw her clearly and valued her completely. And Klaus daggered her each time, drove an ash-soaked dagger through her heart and placed her in a coffin and carried her with him as he moved from place to place, keeping her neutralized for decades or for centuries, at a stretch whenever her choices threatened to separate her from the family, or whenever her happiness with someone else made him feel the abandonment he could never tolerate and never honestly acknowledged as the driving force behind so much of his cruelty toward the people he loved most. The injustice of Rebecca's situation was compounded by the fact that she never stopped loving her brother despite everything he did to her, her loyalty to the family surviving daggering after daggering in a way that spoke either to the depth of her love or to the effectiveness of the psychological patterns that had been established in childhood, and that immortality had only entrenched more deeply. The dagger was Klaus's most intimate weapon, and its repeated use against his own siblings was perhaps the clearest expression of his fundamental dysfunction. The inability to accept that love which is freely given is categorically different from love which is imprisoned, that keeping someone close through force is not the same as being chosen, and that a family held together by daggers and by coffins and by the threat of centuries of paralyzed darkness is not a family, but a collection of hostages who have been taught to call their captivity devotion. Finn spent 900 years in his coffin, daggered so early and left neutralized for so long that when he finally emerged, he had not adjusted to the world, but had only deepened in his self-loathing and his conviction that what their mother had made them was an abomination that deserved to be ended rather than continued. His was perhaps the most tragic trajectory of all the siblings. A man who had wanted to die for most of his immortal existence, and who had been denied even that release by a brother who kept him in suspended darkness, rather than allowing him the permanent death he sought, or the free life he might theoretically have built, if Klaus had trusted him with his own choices. Cole was daggered and undaggered repeatedly across the centuries. His chaotic energy and his genuine delight in causing disruption, making him simultaneously one of the most dangerous members of the family and one of the most honestly self-aware, a vampire who never pretended to be better than he was, and who found the pretensions of more self-serious immortals genuinely and vocally amusing in a way that made him infuriating and oddly refreshing in equal measure. The siblings moved through history, leaving marks that the official record could not account for. Their presence felt in the architecture of cities and in the politics of courts and in the supernatural communities that formed around them wherever they settled long enough to establish themselves. They were in Renaissance Italy when the artistic transformation of that period was reshaping the European understanding of what human beings were capable of creating. And Klaus's genuine love of art expressed itself during those years in patronage and in friendships with painters and with sculptors, whose work he would carry with him across the following centuries as the only constant in a life defined by motion and by loss. They were in New Orleans in the early 20th century, drawn to a city that had its own complex relationship with the supernatural woven into its culture and its soil, and its particular understanding of death and celebration as forces that belong together rather than in opposition. A city that felt more like home than anywhere they had been since the village that no longer existed, and that would eventually call Klaus back for reasons that went beyond sentiment, and that involved a child and a legacy, and a different kind of love than any he had allowed himself before. The recurring return to Mystic Falls across the centuries was not accidental. The land retaining whatever power it had possessed when Esther had drawn on it for the original spell. The convergence of supernatural energy making it a place that attracted and held the attention of beings who could feel such things beneath the surface of what appeared to the ordinary eye to be simply another small town with a pleasant main street and a history that extended back to the colonial period. They were there in 1848 and again during the Civil War era. Their passage through the town, leaving traces in the founding family's records and in the supernatural history of the area that would not be fully understood until Elena Gilbert began pulling at the threads of Mystic Falls' past and discovered how far back the roots of its present actually extended, and how many of the town's defining events had occurred in the shadow of the original family's history. It was in the context of Klaus's centuries-long obsession with breaking his hybrid curse that a Bulgarian girl named Katerina Petrova entered the story and became the knot around which everything else would eventually tangle. Born in 1473 into a family of modest means in a small village outside of Bulgaria's larger cities, she was the Petrova doppelganger, a mirror image of the original Tatia, whose blood had been used in the Moonstone Curse, a face that nature kept reproducing through the Petrova bloodline, as though the universe were maintaining a debt or fulfilling a pattern whose logic only became clear when you understood what the face was for and what it cost the person wearing it. Klaus needed the doppelganger's blood for the sacrifice ritual that would break the hybrid curse his mother had placed on him. And Katerina was the doppelganger he found after centuries of searching. The girl whose existence represented the convergence of all the elements he had been assembling and waiting for across a millennium of frustrated pursuit. What Klaus had not accounted for was that Katerina Petrova had already lost everything before she ever met him. Her family's respect, her home, the child taken from her at birth because she had conceived it outside of marriage in a community where such things carried consequences that fell entirely on the woman and not at all on the man, and that someone who had already survived that particular quality of loss had a relationship with self-preservation that was not governed by the normal calculus of fear and risk that kept most people within the boundaries of acceptable behavior. She ran from Klaus with a decisiveness and a resourcefulness that caught him entirely off guard, finding a vampire named Rose and using her blood to complete her own transition into vampirism, destroying the ritual's requirement for a human doppelganger by becoming something the sacrifice could no longer use. The escape was brilliant, and it was ruthless, and it set in motion 500 years of consequences that touched everyone who came into contact with Katerina Petrova across the following centuries. But it kept her alive, and it revealed something about her character that transformation into Catherine Pierce would only sharpen and refine. She always found a way to survive, and she was entirely willing to let other people pay the cost of that survival when her own resources were insufficient. Klaus hunted her across 500 years with the focused fury of someone who had been outmaneuvered and who experienced that outmaneuvering as a personal insult that no amount of time could adequately diminish. The hunt drove Catherine into permanent motion and permanent performance. The accumulated layers of false identity and strategic manipulation eventually becoming so thoroughly her actual personality that the frightened Bulgarian girl who had lost her child and run from an original vampire existed only in fragments beneath the polished, dangerous surface of the woman she had constructed across centuries of necessity. She moved through history, leaving her own trail of damage and of turned vampires and of people used and discarded, always staying one step ahead of Klaus, always calculating, always surviving, until the story brought her back to Mystic Falls and to the face she shared with Elena Gilbert, and the running that had defined 500 years of her existence finally ran out of road. Mystic Falls, Virginia was the kind of small town that presented itself to the world with the confidence of a place that had always known exactly what it was. A community of old money and older trees, of church socials and founding family galas, and a main street that looked like it had been preserved in amber sometime around 1950 and had simply declined to update itself in the decades that followed. The people who lived there were proud of their history in the particular way that communities built on selective memory are proud, celebrating the parts of the past that reflected well on their ancestors and maintaining careful silence about the parts that did not. The silence so thoroughly established across generations that most of the town's residents had genuinely forgotten there was anything to be silent about, and had come to believe that Mystic Falls was simply what it appeared to be, a pleasant, unremarkable Virginia town, whose most notable characteristic was its commitment to its own traditions. The truth that ran beneath that pleasant surface was older than the founding families and older than the town's official history, and was rooted in the same convergence of supernatural power that had drawn the Mikhailson family to that particular piece of land over 1,000 years before the first colonial settlers had arrived with their land grants and their ambitions. The earth beneath Mystic Falls carried something that did not diminish with the passage of centuries and did not dissipate when the people who understood its nature were replaced by people who did not. The power simply continuing to exist in the soil and in the water, and in the particular quality of the air on certain nights when the veil between the natural and the supernatural was thinner than it was in places where the ground had not been charged with a millennium of magical consequence. Witches felt it most acutely, the Bennett line in particular having maintained a continuous relationship with that power across generations of women who had been born in Mystic Falls, or who had been drawn to it through the same attraction that drew every supernatural creature eventually back to the place where the story had begun. The founding families arrived in the colonial period and established themselves with a combination of industry and ruthlessness that characterized the building of American towns in eras when land was taken rather than purchased, and when the history of who had been there before was rewritten to justify the history of who was there now. The Salvatores and the Forbes and the Lockwoods and the Gilberts and the Bennets became the town's permanent aristocracy, their names on the buildings and the streets and the annual events that marked Mystic Falls' calendar with the regularity of liturgy. What distinguished these families from the founding families of other comparable Virginia towns was not their wealth or their longevity, but the knowledge they carried and passed down through their generations. The awareness that the supernatural world was real and was present in their town and required active management by people who understood what they were dealing with and who had the means and the will to deal with it. The Founders Council was the institution through which that management was exercised, a private organization whose membership was drawn from the founding families and whose existence was unknown to the general population of Mystic Falls, including most members of those founding families who had not yet been initiated into its purposes. The council met privately and maintained records of supernatural activity in the area and coordinated responses when vampires or other creatures made themselves known in ways that threatened the town's safety or threatened to expose the supernatural world to people who were not prepared for that knowledge and who could not be trusted to respond to it with the discretion that the situation required. The methods the council used across its history were not always clean or always just, their approach to supernatural threats reflecting the assumptions of the eras in which those threats arose, and sometimes reflecting the personal vendettas and the private ambitions of the council members themselves. The most significant event in Mystic Falls' documented supernatural history occurred in 1864 during the Civil War, when Confederate soldiers working in coordination with the founding families rounded up the vampires who had been living in and around the town and transported them to a church that was subsequently set on fire with the intention of destroying every vampire the operation had captured. 27 vampires were taken in. That roundup, their capture, made possible through the use of vervain, which weakened vampires on contact and made them unable to compel their way out of captivity or to use their supernatural strength effectively against captors who were prepared for the encounter with the particular thoroughness of men who believed they were protecting their community from genuine evil. The founding families considered the operation a success and considered the burning of the church the end of the vampire problem in Mystic Falls, a conclusion that would prove catastrophically incorrect when it was eventually revealed that Emily Bennett, a witch who was present during the burning, had used her power to create a pocket of protection beneath the church that had preserved the 27 vampires in a state of suspended animation, rather than allowing them to burn. The tomb beneath the church held them for over a century. their continued existence unknown to the descendants of the families who believed they had ended it, a consequence waiting beneath the town's feet for the moment when someone would disturb it. It was in 1864 Mystic Falls that Stefan and Damon Salvatore had been human, the sons of Giuseppe Salvatore, whose position among the founding families came with the expectation of participation in exactly the kind of supernatural management that the roundup represented. Stefan was the younger brother, 17 years old in that summer, possessed of a gentleness and an idealism that his father considered weakness, and that the world was in the process of educating him out of through the particular curriculum of the 1860s, which included war and its associated losses, and the discovery that the people you trusted most were sometimes capable of betrayals you had not imagined possible. Damon was the older brother, 25, and recently returned from the Confederate Army with a disillusionment that had transformed his natural intensity into something more, openly rebellious and more willing to act on impulses that his earlier self had kept within socially acceptable limits. The brothers were genuinely close beneath the surface tensions of their different temperaments, the bond between them real and important, in ways that neither would have articulated in the language of 1864, but that both would have recognized if asked to name the most significant relationship in their lives. Catherine Pierce arrived in Mystic Falls in that summer and moved into the Salvatore household with the ease of someone who had been managing exactly these kinds of social situations for the better part of 3 decades, and who understood how to make men feel that her presence was their good fortune rather than her calculated decision. She was performing the role of a wealthy young woman of good family displaced by the war. Her beauty and her charm sufficient to explain the attention she attracted without requiring any more complicated explanation, and the performance was flawless, in the way that 500-year-old Catherine's performances were always flawless, because she had been doing this long enough that the performance and the performer had become genuinely difficult to distinguish. She fed on both brothers, and she compelled them to forget, and she drew them both into love with her simultaneously, the parallel seductions serving her practical need for protection and feeding, while also satisfying something in her nature that required the confirmation of being desired and being chosen that centuries of running had made into a psychological necessity rather than simply a preference. Her true nature was discovered during the vampire roundup, the founding family's operation sweeping her up along with the other vampires in the area, and Stefan and Damon both attempted to help her escape with the desperation of young men who had given their hearts to someone and could not recalibrate quickly enough to account for the revelation that she was something other than what she had claimed to be. Their father Giuseppe shot them both when he discovered their intentions. The betrayal of the founding family's mission by his own sons representing a personal and civic failure that he apparently considered more significant than his son's survival. And Stefan and Damon both fell with Catherine's blood already in their systems from her earlier feedings. The transition to vampirism happened in the way that all transitions happened, through death followed by the consumption of human blood, and both brothers woke into immortality in a world that had fundamentally changed and that would never return to what it had been before that summer. The Benedwich lineage represented a different kind of relationship with Mystic Falls' supernatural history than the founding families maintained, their power and their knowledge running alongside the official history rather than directing it. their role in the town's supernatural ecosystem closer to that of stewards than to that of controllers. Sheila Bennett, known to everyone as Grams, was the Bennett witch who would be most directly relevant to the story's present. Her knowledge of her family's history and her understanding of the grimoires that recorded generations of Bennett magic, making her the most significant supernatural resource in Mystic Falls when Elena Gilbert's story began, and when the consequences of 140 years of buried history started resurfacing in ways that required someone with genuine power and genuine wisdom to navigate. She had raised her granddaughter Bonnie with love and with partial knowledge, telling her enough to be curious about her heritage, but not enough to be prepared for what that heritage would eventually ask of her. A decision that Sheila perhaps believed there was protection, but that would prove to be its own kind of cost when the asking arrived, and Bonnie had to learn everything at once under conditions that allowed no margin for error. Mystic Falls in 2009 was a town in the process of forgetting that it had ever known what it was. The Founders Council still meeting, but meeting with less urgency and less genuine knowledge than its earlier iterations had possessed. The supernatural history feeling more like local legend than like operational reality to a generation of founding family descendants who had grown up in a relatively quiet period and who had not yet been required to use the knowledge their families had maintained across the generations. The quiet would not last. It never did in Mystic Falls, where the earth remembered everything and where the past had a way of pressing upward through the surface of the present with the patient insistence of something that has been waiting a very long time and has finally decided that the waiting is over. Elena Gilbert was 17 years old in the autumn of 2009, and she was the kind of person that other people instinctively oriented toward without being entirely able to explain why. Her warmth and her genuine interest in the people around her, creating a gravitational pull that had nothing to do with calculation and everything to do with a nature that had been formed in a household where love was expressed through attention and through showing up and through the particular quality of presence that made the people you loved feel that they were the most important thing in the room. She was beautiful in the way that people are beautiful when their interior life is visible in their face, her expressiveness making her features more striking than their individual components might have suggested. And she moved through the social world of Mystic Falls High School with the ease of someone who had grown up at its center and who had never had reason to question whether she belonged there or whether she was welcome in the spaces that her warmth had helped to create and maintain across the years of her adolescence. Her parents were Grayson and Miranda Gilbert, and the life they had built together in Mystic Falls was the kind of life that looked from the outside exactly like what it was. A genuinely happy family in a house that felt like a home, with routines and traditions and the particular texture of daily existence that accumulates in places where people have chosen to stay and have found that staying was worth choosing again and again across years that gave them more reasons to remain rather than reasons to leave. Grayson was a doctor whose commitment to his patients carried the same quality of genuine care that Elena had inherited, and that expressed itself differently in medicine than it did in friendship, but that came from the same fundamental source in a man who had decided early that his life would be organized around helping people, and who had never found reason to revise that decision. Miranda was the kind of mother whose love was practical and demonstrative, simultaneously, who showed up for every performance and every crisis and every ordinary Tuesday with the same level of presence that made her children feel permanently held, even when she was not physically in the room. The kind of parenting that instills in children a baseline security they carry forward into every relationship they form, long after the parent is no longer there to provide it directly. Elena had a brother, Jeremy, who was 2 years younger and who occupied the specific position of younger sibling, with the specific combination of affection and rivalry that characterizes that relationship when it is fundamentally healthy beneath its surface friction. The two of them close in the way that children who have grown up in a genuinely loving household are close, not without conflict or without the ordinary irritations of shared space and shared parents, but with an underlying bond of loyalty and of genuine care that persisted beneath whatever argument or whatever distance the current week had introduced between them. The Gilbert household was not a perfect household, because no household is, but it was a good one in the ways that matter most, and the loss of it would leave a shape in Eleanor and Jeremy that no subsequent experience would completely fill. The accident happened on the night of May 23rd, 2009, on Wickery Bridge, which crossed the river at the edge of town, and which had the particular quality of familiarity that bridges in small towns accumulate when generations of people have crossed them so many times that the crossing becomes invisible and the bridge becomes simply part of the landscape rather than a structure suspended over water with all the vulnerability that implies. Grayson was driving and Miranda was in the passenger seat and Elena was in the back, returning from a party at a friend's house where she had spent the evening in the ordinary way of 17-year-olds at the end of a school year. And the car went off the bridge in circumstances that were never entirely clarified and entered the water below with the speed and the finality of something that cannot be taken back once it has happened. A stranger pulled Elena from the submerged car before anyone else could reach it, bringing her to the surface and to safety, and then disappearing before she could ask his name or see his face clearly enough to recognize him later, leaving her on the riverbank with her life and without her parents, and without any explanation for why she had survived when they had not, and without any framework for understanding what the rest of her life was supposed to look like now that the people who had been its foundation were gone. The stranger was Stefan Salvatore, who had returned to Mystic Falls that summer for reasons he had initially told himself were simple curiosity about the town where his human life had been lived and ended, and where the history that had made him what he was remained embedded in the architecture and the soil in ways that called to him across the century and a half of his vampire existence. He had recognized Elena the moment he saw her as the living image of Catherine Pierce, the doppelganger, whose existence meant something specific and something significant to anyone who knew the history of the Petrova line and understood what that face represented in the context of supernatural history that stretched back 500 years to a Bulgarian village and a girl who had run from an original vampire and changed the course of everything by surviving. He had saved her instinctively, the decision made in the fraction of a second between seeing her and acting. And then he had retreated because staying would have required explanations he was not prepared to give, and because the sight of Catherine's face on a human girl who had no idea what she was or what she carried had unsettled him in ways he needed time to process before he could trust himself to be near her without the confusion of past and present making him into something she could not safely be around. The grief that followed the accident remade Elena in ways that she was still in the process of understanding when the school year began in September. The summer having passed in a blur of arrangements and condolences, and the particular administrative cruelty of death in a society that requires the bereaved to make dozens of practical decisions at the precise moment when they are least equipped to make any decisions at all. She'd quit the cheerleading team, whose social world had previously structured much of her time and her identity. The performances and the competitions and the carefully maintained social hierarchies feeling hollow in the aftermath of loss in the way that activities chosen during one version of yourself can feel like costumes belonging to someone who no longer exists and who cannot be inhabited again simply by putting the costume back on. She moved through the familiar spaces of her life with the slightly disconnected quality of someone who recognizes everything around them and feels nothing quite connecting. The town and the school and the friendships all still present and still real, but filtered through a grief that changed the texture of everything it touched. She had begun keeping a journal, the daily writing providing a container for the thoughts and the feelings that were too complicated and too constant to simply carry without somewhere to put them. And the journal became one of the most consistent narrative devices the story would employ across its 8 seasons. A record of interior experience in a story that was fundamentally about the gap between what people showed the world and what they actually felt, between the performance of normalcy and the reality of living with extraordinary things that could not be spoken about in ordinary conversation. The journal was also an act of deliberate continuity. Eleanor, writing because her mother had written, and because the practice connected her to Miranda across the absence in ways that nothing else quite managed. The blank pages representing both loss and the decision to continue filling the world with her own voice, despite the silence where her mother's voice had been. She was trying, with a genuine effort that characterized everything she did, to rebuild herself around the absence of her parents without losing the warmth and the capacity for love that had defined her before the accident, and that she recognized correctly as the most essential thing about herself and the thing most worth protecting. When grief made the easier path seem to be the one where you stop feeling as much and stop caring as deeply, and accepted the numbness that loss sometimes offers as a kind of mercy that is actually a kind of slow erasure. The friends who surrounded her could see the effort she was making and loved her for it, and helped her maintain it on the days when maintaining it required more than she could generate entirely from within herself. The support network of Bonnie and Caroline and the other people who made up Elena's world in Mystic Falls, functioning as the scaffolding that held the rebuilding together while the new structure found its own stability. Jeremy was not trying in the same way, or perhaps he was trying, and the shape of his trying looked from the outside like the opposite of effort, the grief expressing itself through channels that led toward damage rather than toward reconstruction, in the particular way of adolescent boys who have not been given adequate language for pain and who therefore express it through behavior rather than through the words that might eventually make it manageable. He had retreated into drug use and into a social world that Mystic Falls adults found concerning, and that his sister found frightening in the particular way that watching someone you love move towards self-destruction is frightening when you can see clearly what is happening and cannot find the lever that will reverse it, because the lever does not exist from the outside and can only be found from within by the person who is lost, and only when they are ready to find it. His grief was as real as Elena's, and as valid as Elena's, and was simply expressing itself through a different and more obviously dangerous channel. The pain seeking an exit that numbed it, rather than an exit that processed it, which was not a character flaw, but was a recognizably human response to loss that the show treated with the consistency and the compassion it deserved, rather than reducing Jeremy to simply the troubled younger brother, whose storyline existed to complicate Elena's. Jenna Summers had become their legal guardian after the accident. Elena and Jeremy's aunt by Miranda's side of the family, young and genuinely unprepared for the responsibility of raising two grieving teenagers in a house that still held the shape of the family it had been before the bridge, and that required someone to maintain that shape against the entropy that grief produced in the spaces where the people who had held everything together used to stand. Jenna was loving and was present and was doing her absolute best with a situation that had been handed to her rather than chosen. Her youth and her inexperience sometimes making her more peer than parent, and her own grief about Miranda's death, adding a layer of complexity to her guardianship that she navigated with more grace than she gave herself credit for. She had her own life that had been interrupted by the accident, and her own ambitions that had been set aside, and her own romantic history that the story would eventually bring back into focus. But in the immediate aftermath of the Gilberts' deaths, she had simply shown up and kept showing up in the way that people who love someone show up when the showing up is the only thing that matters. Bonnie Bennett had been Elena's best friend for long enough that their friendship had the quality of something structural rather than something chosen. The kind of relationship that has been part of your life for so long that imagining your life without it requires imagining a fundamentally different version of yourself, one who had been shaped by different experiences and different loyalties, and who had therefore become a different person entirely. Bonnie was discovering in that autumn that her grandmother's stories about their family's heritage as witches were not simply stories or metaphors for the particular kind of intuitive perception that some people possessed more than others. The psychic hunches and the small, inexplicable things that had been happening around her for years, beginning to cohere into a pattern that was impossible to explain through coincidence, and that pointed towards something real and something inherited and something that was going to require her to fundamentally revise her understanding of what the world was and what she was within it. She carried this discovery alongside her grief about Elena's parents and her concern about Jeremy and her ordinary teenage life with the quiet competence that was characteristic of Bonnie at every stage of her story. The girl managed everything for everyone, and who rarely asked for the same management in return. Caroline Forbes occupied a specific and painful position in the social ecosystem of Mystic Falls High School. Her surface confidence and her relentless overachievement concealing an interior life that was considerably more anxious and more uncertain than her exterior suggested to people who did not look carefully enough, or who found it easier to accept the performance than to wonder what it was protecting. She was Elena's close friend and Bonnie's close friend, and she was genuinely loyal and genuinely loving, beneath the competitiveness and the occasional sharp edges that emerged when her insecurity was activated by comparison or by the sense that she was being overlooked in favor of someone else whose qualities were more immediately legible than hers. She had been told in various ways across her entire life that she was not quite enough, not as naturally warm as Elena, not as powerfully gifted as Bonnie, not as effortlessly beloved as the people she most admired. And she had responded to that messaging by working harder and performing more thoroughly and maintaining a level of social vigilance that was exhausting to sustain, and that would eventually give way under the pressure of supernatural transformation into something that proved all of the assessments wrong and revealed Caroline Forbes to be one of the most remarkable people in a story full of remarkable people. Tyler Lockwood carried his position as the mayor's son with the particular aggression of someone who has been told his whole life that he is important, without being given a coherent framework for what importance is supposed to mean in practice or how it is supposed to express itself in relation to the people around him, who had not been assigned the same significance by the accident of their birth. He was quick to anger in ways that occasionally crossed lines, and that his family's position in the town had historically protected him from the consequences of crossing. And the anger masked a deeper confusion about his own nature that he did not yet have language for, because the Lockwood family's werewolf heritage was a secret kept even from the werewolves themselves, until circumstances made the keeping impossible and the revelation inevitable. Stefan Salvatore enrolled at Mystic Falls High School in September of 2009. His presence representing a decision he had made, and then immediately begun to doubt. The intention to observe Elena from a safe distance, collapsing almost immediately upon actual proximity to her, because she was not Catherine, and the difference mattered enormously and unexpectedly. Their first real encounter happened in the graveyard, where Elena had gone to write. The quiet of that place and the honesty it invited, creating conditions for a conversation that went deeper than first conversations typically go. Two people who had both lost things they could not recover, finding in each other an understanding that asked no explanation and offered no false comfort, and simply recognized that some grief could not be argued with or resolved but could be witnessed, and that witnessing it with someone who did not flinch was its own rare and necessary form of grace. Stefan Salvatore had been a vampire for 162 years when he returned to Mystic Falls in the autumn of 2009, and the weight of those years was carried in him not as visible age or as the particular weariness that long human lives accumulate in the body, but as something internal and something carefully managed. A history of violence and of grief and of periodic catastrophic failure that he had organized his entire existence around, containing and around preventing from repeating. He was what the show would eventually term a ripper, a vampire whose relationship with human blood was not simply a matter of hunger and of management, but was closer to addiction in the clinical sense. The consumption of blood triggering in Stefan a loss of control so complete that it erased the boundaries and the moral commitments that defined his sober self and left something else entirely in their place. Something capable of levels of violence that the Stefan who returned to Mystic Falls had spent decades trying to ensure would never emerge again, and that he carried the memory of with a shame so profound it had become structural, the foundation on which his careful, controlled animal blood existence was built. The periods of his Ripper history were not ancient aberrations from a vampire who had since evolved beyond them, but were recurring chapters separated by decades of recovery and of control. The most recent and most devastating having occurred in the 1920s in Chicago, where Stefan had fallen under Klaus's influence and had spent years feeding without restraint in a city that offered endless opportunity for someone who had stopped caring about the consequences of his nature. He had killed dozens of people during those years and had felt nothing about the killing except the particular pleasure that blood triggered in him when his control was completely surrendered. And the memory of those years and of those people was part of what he carried back to Mystic Falls and part of what made him believe, with the conviction of someone who has evidence rather than simply fear, that he was genuinely dangerous to the humans he cared about, and that caring about a human was therefore an act that required extraordinary caution and perhaps should not be permitted at all. Lexi Branson had been his closest companion across most of his vampire existence, a vampire of genuine warmth and genuine moral clarity who had attached herself to Stefan in the 1860s, when she recognized in him someone whose fundamental decency was worth the considerable effort of helping him manage his addiction, and who had remained his most consistent source of support and of honest reflection across the century and a half that followed. She visited him periodically, her arrivals always representing a recalibration, a return to the values and the practices that kept him functioning as something he could respect rather than something he feared. She had been in New York when Stefan returned to Mystic Falls, her absence from the story's physical action not diminishing her importance to Stefan's psychological architecture, and her eventual appearance in Mystic Falls would be brief and would be ended by Damon in an act of cold calculation that demonstrated with terrible clarity what Damon was capable of when his priorities required it. Damon Salvatore arrived in Mystic Falls shortly after Stefan, his entrance constructed entirely for maximum disruption and maximum impact in the way that Damon arranged most of his entrances. The performance of carelessness and of casual menace so thoroughly practiced across 160 years that it was no longer entirely performance and had become genuinely difficult to distinguish from his actual character. He was charming in the specific way that people are charming when they have decided that charm is a more efficient tool than sincerity, and have spent long enough practicing the tool that it has become second nature. His wit and his ease and his physical beauty combining into a presentation that was compelling and that was designed to be compelling, and that concealed beneath its surface a degree of genuine pain and genuine damage that he would have violently rejected any suggestion of in those early episodes. His stated motivation for returning was the freeing of Catherine from the tomb beneath the church where he believed she had been sealed since 1864. The love he had maintained for her across 145 years of absence, representing either the most romantic devotion the show had yet introduced, or the most comprehensive example of what happens to grief when it is never processed and never challenged, and is instead preserved in amber and mistaken for loyalty. The relationship between the brothers in those early months was defined by a hostility whose intensity revealed how much history it was carrying. The surface antagonism between them generated not by indifference, but by the opposite of indifference, by the fact that whatever had existed between them before 1864 had been damaged so thoroughly that the damage itself had become the primary content of their relationship, and had been for a century and a half. Damon's promise to give Stefan an eternity of misery had been made on the night of their transition. His fury at Stefan for forcing him to complete the vampire transformation when Damon had been prepared to die, human directed with the precision of someone who understood exactly where to aim to cause the most lasting damage. He had kept the promise methodically and with creativity across the decades, and Stefan had absorbed the damage with the particular stoicism of someone who believed at some level that he deserved it for the choices he had made on that night and for the consequences of those choices across the century and a half that followed. Elena learning the truth about Stefan happened with the inevitability of a conclusion that has been building from the first page, the evidence accumulating too quickly and too obviously for someone of her intelligence and her perceptiveness to continue explaining away through the alternative theories that were less frightening and less impossible than the actual answer. The vampire reveal landed with the force of something that was shocking, and also, in some way she could not immediately articulate, clarifying. The strangeness she'd been sensing in Stefan suddenly explained. The pieces of him that had not quite fit the framework of ordinary human experience suddenly fitting a different framework that required her to revise everything she thought she knew about what was real and what was possible. She ran, because running was the rational response to learning that the person you had been falling in love with was a creature that her family's history and her town's history had organized itself around fearing and containing. And then she came back, because whatever rational response she might construct in the abstract could not compete with the reality of what she felt when she was near him and with the person she had actually experienced rather than the category she had been told to be afraid of. The development of Stefan and Elena's relationship across that first year was characterized by a quality of genuine mutual recognition that the show established as the foundation of their connection, and that distinguished it from the attractions and the infatuations that the other relationships in the story were built on. He saw her clearly, not as Catherine's replacement and not as a supernatural curiosity, but as herself, the specific person she actually was, with her specific grief and her specific courage and her specific way of moving through a world that had recently become considerably more dangerous than she had known it to be. She saw him with a similar clarity and a similar refusal to reduce him to the most frightening version of what he was, her love extending to the history and to the struggle rather than existing in spite of them, which was either profound understanding or profound naivety, and was probably both simultaneously in the way that first loves tend to be. Damon's relationship with Elena in those early months was defined by a dynamic that the show established with considerable craft, and then spent years developing, the genuine antagonism between them that coexisted with moments of unexpected connection that neither of them sought and both of them noticed, the hostility serving as the most honest register of their interaction, because it was the one in which neither of them was performing anything. He compelled her, manipulated people she loved, and committed acts of casual cruelty that she witnessed and that she held against him with the moral seriousness that was characteristic of her. And alongside all of this were moments when his guard dropped and something else was briefly visible, something that responded to her the way that parts of Damon that he had long since decided were liabilities responded to very few things, with something approaching genuine feeling rather than strategic affect. The tomb beneath the church was opened through the combined power of Bonnie Bennett and her grandmother Sheila. The two women channeling the Bennett line's accumulated magical inheritance to move the seal that had been placed there in 1864 and that had required the same lineage to create. The cost of the opening was Sheila's life, the magical exertion too great for her body to survive. Her death, the first of the significant losses that would mark the story's progression, and that would force Bonnie to understand earlier than she should have had to, that her power was not simply a gift, but was a transaction, and that the currency it required was not always hers alone to spend. The revelation that Catherine had never been in the tomb, that she had escaped in 1998 and had been watching from a distance while Damon spent 145 years preserving his love for her in the amber of grief and obsessive loyalty, arrived with the quality of a blow that reorders everything that preceded it. The foundation on which Damon had organized his entire return suddenly revealed as fiction, and the question of what Damon Salvatore actually was when the story he had been telling himself about himself was removed, becoming the question that would drive his arc for the remainder of the series. Lexi's death at Damon's hands came before the tomb's opening. Her presence in Mystic Falls for Stefan's birthday, providing Damon with the opportunity to eliminate a threat to his plans by offering the Founders Council a vampire they could publicly destroy. The calculation cold and the execution swift, and the consequence for Stefan, the loss of the person who had been his most consistent anchor across 160 years of difficult existence. The grief Stefan felt was real and was visible, and was the kind of loss that does not diminish with time, but simply becomes part of the permanent architecture of a person's interior life. Another room in the house of everything that vampiric existence had cost him, that could not be recovered or revisited except in memory. The early months in Mystic Falls established the essential geometry of the story that would unfold across the following years. Eleanor at the center, Stefan and Damon on either side of her, the brothers' relationship with each other inseparable from their relationship with her, and the town's supernatural history pressing in from every direction with the accumulated weight of 1,000 years of consequence that was only just beginning to make itself fully felt in the lives of the people who had been born into its orbit without knowing what they had been born into or what it would eventually ask of them. Catherine Pierce returned to Mystic Falls not with announcement or with confrontation, but with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been managing her own entrances and exits for 500 years, and who understood that the most effective arrivals were the ones that nobody saw coming until the consequences were already in motion. She'd been watching from a distance for longer than anyone knew. Her presence in the periphery of events that seemed unconnected to her revealed gradually as the story peeled back the layers of her involvement and demonstrated that very little of what had happened in Mystic Falls since Stefan's return had been entirely free of Catherine's influence or Catherine's calculation. She had been in the town in 1998, the year she had escaped the tomb that everyone believed she had been sealed inside since 1864, and she had been monitoring the Salvatore brothers, and monitoring Elena, and monitoring the slow approach of the Klaus situation with the attentiveness of someone who understood that the convergence of these particular elements in this particular place was not coincidence, and was not something she could afford to ignore from a comfortable distance. Her full history arrived in pieces across the second and third seasons, each revelation recontextualizing what had come before and adding layers to a character who had initially been presented as simply an obstacle and a mystery, and who gradually became something considerably more complicated. A woman whose capacity for cruelty was real and was documented and was not excused by her history, but whose history explained how someone becomes that particular kind of survivor and what it costs across 5 centuries to maintain the vigilance and the ruthlessness that survival at that level requires. She had been born Katerina Petrova in 1473 in a village in Bulgaria, the daughter of a family whose position was modest and whose expectations for their daughter were conventional, until those expectations were permanently disrupted by a pregnancy outside of marriage that the community responded to with a particular cruelty that communities of that era reserved for women who violated the codes that governed female sexuality and female respectability. The child was taken from her immediately after birth, a daughter she was not permitted to hold or to name or to claim, and the loss of that child was the wound, beneath all other wounds in Catherine's story, the thing she could not speak about and could not process, because speaking about it and processing it would have required admitting a vulnerability that she had decided, somewhere in the years of running that followed, she could no longer afford to carry. Klaus had found her through the Petrova bloodline, the doppelganger face announcing itself to anyone who understood what it meant and who had been searching for it long enough, and his intentions toward her had been entirely practical. She was the final piece of a ritual he had been assembling for a millennium, and her value to him was entirely instrumental. The value of a tool rather than of a person. The value of a key that had been forged by nature to fit a specific lock without any reference to the key's own desires or the key's own future after the lock was opened. She had understood this quickly and had acted on her understanding with the decisiveness that would characterize every significant choice of her next 500 years. Finding a vampire named Rose who owed a debt to the Mikkelsen family and using that connection to access the vampire blood she needed, completing her own transition before Klaus could use her as a human doppelganger, and removing herself permanently from the ritual's requirements by becoming something it could no longer accommodate. The moonstone curse that Klaus had spent 1,000 years trying to break was explained to Elena and to the audience across the second season with the careful pacing of a revelation that the show understood needed to be delivered in layers rather than all at once, each layer adding complexity to what had initially seemed like a straightforward supernatural conflict between an ancient hybrid and the people trying to prevent him from achieving his goals. The curse required specific elements aligned in specific ways. A Petrova doppelganger whose blood would be spilled, a witch to channel the power of the break, a werewolf and a vampire sacrificed to release the respective locks on Klaus's hybrid nature, and the moonstone which had been used in the original binding and whose destruction would complete the unraveling of what Esther had sealed into it. Klaus had spent centuries accumulating the necessary elements and losing them and beginning again. The doppelganger, always the most difficult piece to secure because the Petrova line produced them rarely, and because the one he had found in 1492 had escaped and had spent 500 years ensuring that Klaus never got close enough to use her. Elijah arrived in Mystic Falls before Klaus, his presence preceding his brothers with the particular quality of Elijah's arrivals throughout the story. Composed, deliberately understated, carrying an agenda that was related to but not identical with whatever agenda the people around him assumed he was pursuing. He made an alliance with Elena that was genuine within its specific parameters. His promise to protect her family and the people she loved, contingent on her cooperation with a plan he had developed across centuries of managing Klaus's obsessions, and that he believed offered the best available chance of destroying his brother permanently without the collateral damage that other approaches would produce. Elena trusted him with the particular trust she extended to people whose honor she could recognize, even when their methods were opaque. Her instinct for the difference between people who were dangerous because they were cruel and people who were dangerous because they were committed to something larger than any individual interaction, serving her reasonably well in her dealings with Elijah, even when his commitments required him to make choices she would not have made herself. The 21 steps Elena took to understand and to navigate the sacrifice represented one of the clearest expressions of her character across the entire series, the process through which she gathered information and made her peace with her own death and tried to protect everyone she loved from the consequences of what was coming, demonstrating the particular combination of courage and empathy and moral clarity that defined her at her best. She did not want to die. The show was honest about that, did not dress her acceptance in the nobility that erased the fear. But she had decided that her death was preferable to the alternative of watching the people she loved destroyed in her place. And she moved toward the sacrifice with the deliberate focus of someone who has made a decision that is final and who therefore does not need to keep making it over and over in the space where the fear lives. The decision also reflected her understanding of herself as someone whose choices had consequences for the people around her, not through any fault of her own, but simply through the accident of what she was, the doppelganger face making her the center of a supernatural conflict she had not sought, and that was going to resolve itself one way or another, regardless of whether she participated actively or was simply acted upon. Damon's decision to force his blood into Elena's system without her knowledge or her consent in the hours before the sacrifice was one of the most significant moral failures of his arc across the entire series, the act motivated by genuine terror at the prospect of losing her, but executed in complete disregard of everything she had communicated about her own choices and her own values regarding her life and what she wanted it to be. He had listened to her explain why she accepted the sacrifice and had heard her articulate clearly that she did not want to become a vampire and that she was making her choice freely and with full understanding of its consequences. And he had fed her his blood anyway, because his fear was louder than her voice in that moment, and because the pattern of his existence had accustomed him to prioritizing his own assessment of what was necessary over other people's clearly expressed preferences when those preferences conflicted with what he wanted. Elena did not forgive this easily, and the show did not ask the audience to forgive it easily. The violation of her autonomy, standing as evidence of something in Damon that genuine love had not yet managed to fully reach. Klaus arrived in Mystic Falls, occupying the body of Alaric Salzman, a history teacher at Mystic Falls High School, whose connection to the supernatural world had begun with the death of his wife Isabel, and whose presence in Elena's life had evolved into something genuinely paternal and genuinely important. His body being used as a vessel for the original hybrid's consciousness, representing both a violation of Alaric himself and a tactical choice by Klaus to enter the situation without announcing himself through his own appearance. The reveal of Klaus inside Alaric was constructed for maximum impact and achieved it. The familiar face and the altered presence creating a version of wrongness that was more disturbing than an unfamiliar villain's arrival would have been, because it used something trusted to deliver something threatening. The sacrifice itself was constructed as the climax of 2 seasons of build-up, and it delivered the losses it had been building toward with the unflinching commitment to consequence that characterized the show at its most serious. Jenna Summers, Elena's aunt and guardian, was turned vampire by Klaus in the ritual's final moments to serve as the vampire sacrifice, her transformation happening too quickly and too violently for anyone to prevent it, and her death in the ritual following immediately after, her vampire existence lasting less than an hour and ending before she had time to understand what she had become, or to say goodbye to the people she had been trying to hold together since Miranda Gilbert's death had placed her in their care. John Gilbert, Elena's biological father, who had spent most of his time in the story as an antagonist, and as someone whose motives were consistently complicated by his history and his secrets, died through a magical transference arranged by a witch sympathetic to Elena's situation. His life force used to counteract the vampire blood in Elena's system and prevent her transition, ensuring she woke human rather than in the middle of a transition she had never chosen. Elena woke to a world that had taken 2 more people from her in a single night, the losses compounding the losses that had preceded them, and creating a grief that the story did not minimize or rush through, but allowed to sit in the space it occupied with the weight it deserved. Klaus had achieved his transformation into the first true hybrid, his 1,000-year quest completed on the night that Jenna Summers died not knowing what vampires were, and John Gilbert died knowing exactly what he was and choosing it anyway, and the power he achieved in that moment, and the army of sired hybrids he began building in its aftermath, represented a threat of a different order than anything the story had yet introduced. Not a single powerful vampire with a complicated history, but an original hybrid with a sire bond over every vampire wolf he created, and with a millennium of frustrated ambition now fully unleashed into a world that had no established mechanism for containing it. The aftermath of the sacrifice settled into the story with the quiet devastation of things that cannot be undone. The Salvatore brothers and Bonnie and Caroline and everyone else who had been part of the effort to prevent it absorbing the reality of what had happened and beginning the slow process of determining what came next in a world where Klaus was free and where the people who had tried to stop him were still standing, but were standing in different configurations than before, shaped by loss and by the choices they had made under pressure and by the knowledge of what they were each capable of when the stakes were absolute and the margin for error was zero. The Mikkelsen siblings arrived in Mystic Falls in their fullest configuration during the third season, the original family assembling in the town where their story had begun, with the particular quality of returns that carried the weight of everything that happened in the intervening centuries compressed into the present moment and expressed through the specific tensions and the specific loyalties that 1,000 years of shared history had produced between people who loved each other and had repeatedly destroyed each other, and who could not seem to manage either the loving or the destroying completely enough to make the other unnecessary. Finn was undaggered with the self-loathing already fully formed that 900 years in a coffin had not created but had certainly deepened. His conviction that vampirism was an abomination requiring correction rather than accommodation, placing him in fundamental opposition to the continued existence of his own family in ways that made him simultaneously the most morally consistent and the most tragic of the siblings. A man who had wanted death for the majority of his immortal life, and who had been denied it by the brother whose possessiveness extended even to the siblings he did not particularly like. Cole arrived with the energy of someone who had been waiting for centuries to be allowed back into the world and who intended to make the most of the access. His delight in chaos and in violence genuine rather than performed, and his relationship with the rules that governed supernatural behavior in Mystic Falls, approximately equivalent to his relationship with the daggers Klaus had used on him. Theoretical awareness of their existence combined with complete practical indifference to their authority. Rebecca's presence in Mystic Falls was the most emotionally complex of the three undaggered siblings. Her history with the town extending back to 1864, when she had been there as a human-presenting vampire, and had fallen in love, and had been daggered by Klaus when her love threatened to keep her in one place while he needed to keep moving. The return to the town where that had happened carried the specific grief of revisiting a place where you were happy before someone took the happiness from you. And Rebecca moved through Mystic Falls High School with the brittle aggression of someone who was daring the world to try to hurt her again, and who had constructed her defenses so thoroughly in the centuries since that she occasionally forgot there was anything left inside them worth protecting. Her relationship with Elena was hostile from the beginning and became genuinely dangerous at points. But it was also one of the show's most honest explorations of what it looks like when two people recognize something essential in each other that they would both prefer not to acknowledge. The revelation of the linked bloodline transformed the tactical situation in Mystic Falls with the completeness of a revelation that removes options rather than adding them. The understanding that killing an original would destroy every vampire descended from their bloodline, meaning that the Salvatore brothers could not safely participate in any plan to permanently end Klaus without risking their own deaths and the deaths of Caroline and Tyler and every other vampire in Mystic Falls, whose continued existence depended on the continued existence of whichever original had been the origin of their particular bloodline. The question of which brother belonged to which bloodline became one of the season's sustained sources of tension. The answer, withheld long enough to ensure that every plan made in ignorance of it carried genuine risk, and that the eventual confirmation arrived with the relief of certainty, even when the certainty itself was uncomfortable. Mikhail's history was excavated across the third season, with the accumulating horror of a backstory that kept revealing new depths of damage beneath the depths already visible. The portrait of the original patriarch, emerging not as a simple monster, but as something more disturbing. A man whose cruelty predated his vampirism and whose transformation had simply removed the social and biological constraints that had previously placed limits on what his cruelty could accomplish. He had been a cold and punishing father in his human life, his standards for his children calibrated for his own ego, rather than for their development, his love expressed so consistently through criticism and through withholding that his children had spent their human childhoods learning that love was something you earned through performance, rather than something you received through existence. The vampirism had taken those qualities and made them permanent and made them dangerous at a scale that human cruelty could not achieve. His 1,000-year pursuit of Klaus, driven by genuine hatred that had long since consumed whatever grief about Esther's betrayal might have originally motivated it. Elena's death at the conclusion of the third season arrived through Rebecca's intervention on Wickery Bridge. The symmetry with the accident that had killed her parents on that same bridge, deliberate and devastating. The location chosen by the story, with the particular economy of a narrative that understands how geography carries emotional meaning and how returning to the site of one wound to inflict another compounds both. Rebecca ran Elena's car off the bridge in an act of petty vengeance that was calibrated to hurt Stefan, and that succeeded in that purpose, while also producing consequences that Rebecca had not fully calculated. Elena dying with Damon's blood in her system from an emergency feeding earlier in the day, her body completing the transition to vampirism in the water, while Stefan was forced by her own instruction to save Matt Donovan first. She had asked Stefan to save Matt. The choice was entirely characteristic of her. The person most likely to survive was the human, and Elena had made the calculation and communicated it clearly before the car went into the water, the decision representing both her courage and the particular quality of her love that expressed itself through putting other people's survival above her own. The transition and the sire bond emerged together as the twin complications of Elena's new vampire existence, the biological reality of having been turned on Damon's blood, creating a supernatural connection between them, that the show spent the entirety of the fourth season interrogating with genuine moral seriousness. The sire bond meant that Elena's behavior as a new vampire was shaped by Damon's wishes in ways that could not be entirely disentangled from her own genuine feelings. The connection operating below the level of conscious choice and making it impossible to determine with certainty whether what she felt for him was the product of her own emotional development or the product of a supernatural influence that had been introduced without her knowledge or her consent. Damon's position was that the feelings were real and the sire bond only affected behavior, not emotion. Stefan's position was that the distinction was impossible to maintain when behavior and emotion were so thoroughly entangled in practice. Elena's position was that she knew her own feelings and resented the implication that she did not. All three positions were defensible and none of them resolved the question, which was precisely the point. Jeremy's death arrived in the fourth season, with the finality of a loss that the show had been building toward through the escalating cost of his supernatural entanglements. His death at the hands of Silas, the ancient immortal, whose existence predated vampires and whose power exceeded everything that had come before him in the story's supernatural hierarchy landing. With the weight of the loss it represented for Elena, and forcing the event that the season had been building toward from its first episode, Elena turned off her humanity. The switch, a uniquely vampire psychological mechanism, the ability to simply stop feeling in a way that human psychology could approach but could never fully achieve, represented the show's most direct engagement with the question of what grief looks like when the person experiencing it has access to an exit that most grieving people do not. She chose the exit because the alternative was feeling Jeremy's death in the full register of her humanity, and the full register of that particular loss was more than she was able to carry in the body she had recently acquired that amplified everything, including pain. What followed was the show's most unflinching portrait of what the most empathetic character in the story looked like without the empathy. The Elena who moved through the fourth season's latter half-cold and purposeful, and entirely free of the guilt and the compassion that had previously governed every decision she made. She burned down the Gilbert house with Damon inside it as a demonstration of her indifference. She manipulated the people who loved her with a precision that was more disturbing than simple cruelty, because it used her knowledge of them, the intimate knowledge that only genuine love accumulates, in service of her own protection and her own freedom from the consequences they were trying to impose on her. She was not a different person without her humanity, but was the same person with the filter removed, and what the filter had been filtering became visible in its absence in ways that were genuinely illuminating about the nature of empathy as a regulating force in human and vampire behavior. The cure for vampirism was introduced as the season's central object of pursuit, its existence discovered through the unraveling of a mystery connected to Silas's island and to the ancient immortal's own desire for death after 2,000 years of existence that he had never wanted and had never made peace with. The cure was a single dose, enough for one person, and its discovery immediately raised the question of who it was for and who had the right to decide. The answer shifting across the season as different characters' claims to it were established and then complicated by events that changed what the cure meant and what it would cost whoever took it. It was ultimately used on Catherine Pierce in one of the season's most elegantly constructed reversals. The woman who had spent 500 years running from Klaus and from death and from vulnerability, finding herself suddenly human again at the age that she had been when she had first run. The gift and the punishment arriving simultaneously in the same moment and in the same act. Stefan and Elena's relationship reached its formal conclusion across the fourth season. The combination of the sire bond's complications and Elena's no humanity period, and the fundamental shift in her emotional orientation that her transition had produced, making it impossible to maintain the pretense that what they had been to each other in her human life was still available to them in her vampire life, in the same form and with the same meaning. The ending was honest rather than dramatic, the show acknowledging that people can love each other genuinely and still not be the right people for each other at a particular point in their lives and their development. The love real and the relationship over, and both things true simultaneously. Damon and Elena's beginning was built on the foundation of everything that had been established about them across 4 seasons of circling each other. The choice Elena made toward Damon Not a betrayal of what she had felt for Stefan, but a recognition of what she had become, and what that becoming required in terms of who she needed beside her. The No Humanity arc concluded when Matt Donovan looked at Elena and told her that Jeremy would be ashamed of what she had become, the specific cruelty of that specific statement from that specific person breaking through the switch with the force that only targeted truth can generate. The grief that she had been avoiding rushing back in a wave that was physical in its intensity, and that confirmed both that the feelings were still there waiting, and that turning them off had not processed them, but had only deferred them into a larger accumulation that arrived all at once with the weight of everything that had been added to it during the months of absence. She turned her humanity back on, and she felt Jeremy's death for the first time, and it was as terrible as she had known it would be, and she survived it, which is the point the show had been making across the entire arc, that the grief you run from does not diminish in the running, and that surviving it when you finally stop running is the only thing that actually moves you through it. The Gemini Coven occupied a specific and largely hidden corner of the supernatural world that the story had been building across its first 4 seasons. A witch coven whose existence and whose internal traditions had remained unknown to the people in Mystic Falls until the events of the 6th season made their history and their particular form of succession magic directly relevant to the lives of everyone caught in the orbit of what Kai Parker had done and what the Coven had done in response to him. The Gemini Coven's leadership passed through a tradition unlike anything else in the witch world the show had established. Twins born to the Coven's leader would merge at the age of 22, their magic and their consciousness fusing in a ritual that transferred the power and the identity of the weaker twin into the stronger. The surviving twin emerging from the merge as the next leader of the Coven, with their siblings' magic absorbed into their own and their siblings' life extinguished in the process. The tradition was brutal in the specific way that institutions built around necessity rather than ethics tend to be brutal. The Coven having decided at some point in its history that the production of a supremely powerful leader justified the cost of the twin, who did not survive the production, the calculation made by people who were not the ones paying the cost, and who had therefore found it easier to maintain than it might otherwise have been. Malachi Parker was born the oldest of 6 children to the Gemini Coven's leader, his birth presenting an immediate complication that the Coven's tradition had not fully anticipated. He was a siphoner, a witch born without his own magical power, who could only access magic by drawing it from external sources, from other witches or from magical objects, a condition that the Coven considered an aberration and a deficiency, and that Kai experienced from his earliest childhood as a fundamental rejection by the community that was supposed to be his family and his people. He had grown up understanding that he was considered less than, that his nature made him unworthy of the position his birth order should have guaranteed, and that the Coven's solution to the problem he represented was to wait until his twins were born, and then allow the merge to eliminate him through the mechanism of his own inferiority. The Coven's assessment of him was not entirely without basis. Kai was genuinely dangerous and genuinely without the empathy that might have made his dangerousness manageable. But the chicken and egg question of whether it's dangerous because he had been treated as disposable from birth, or whether he had been treated as disposable because he was dangerous was one the show raised deliberately and declined to answer simply, understanding that the most honest response to that question was that both things were true and that their relationship to each other was circular rather than sequential. His solution to the problem of the merge was to kill his siblings before any of them could be used against him. The massacre of his family on the night he was supposed to be sent away, representing both the logical conclusion of his psychological development and the act that confirmed the Coven's worst assessments of his character. He killed 4 of his siblings and was stopped before he could complete the elimination by the Coven's intervention, and the punishment they chose for him, rather than death, was the prison world, a pocket dimension created through Gemini magic and frozen at a single day in 1994, repeating endlessly, designed to contain him in perfect isolation for whatever eternity the Coven considered appropriate for what he had done. He was sent there alone, with no company and no variation and no exit. The punishment calibrated to be worse than death for someone whose particular psychology made isolation an especially effective form of torment. And he spent decades there alone before Damon Salvatore and Bonnie Bennett arrived and changed the terms of his imprisonment without intending to. Damon and Bonnie's arrival in the prison world came through the destruction of the other side, the supernatural purgatory that had held the souls of dead supernatural beings, and that collapsed at the end of the 5th season in an event whose consequences scattered people across dimensions rather than delivering them to the peaceful death they had expected, or returning them to the living world they had hoped for. They found themselves in Kai's 1994, in the repeating day of May 10th, in a world that looked exactly like the real world, but that contained no other people and that offered no obvious exit. The isolation total and the situation immediately dangerous, because Kai understood the prison world and they did not, and because his interest in them was entirely instrumental from the first moment of contact. He needed a Bennett witch to perform the spell that would allow him to escape. The same bloodline that had created the prison world being the bloodline, whose magic could open its boundaries from the inside. And Bonnie was the Bennett witch available, which made her valuable to him in the specific way that tools are valuable, rather than in the way that people are valuable. The relationship that developed between Damon and Bonnie across their months in the prison world was one of the most unexpected and most genuinely moving developments of the show's later seasons. The two characters having had minimal, meaningful interaction across the first 5 seasons, beyond their mutual status as people who mattered to Elena from different directions and who therefore occasionally occupied the same spaces without ever truly seeing each other. The prison world stripped away the social structures and the relationship hierarchies and the various performances that both of them maintained in their normal lives, and left them with only each other and the daily necessity of surviving a situation that was designed to break the person inside it. Damon's capacity for genuine companionship, which his performances of cynicism and of carelessness had consistently obscured, became visible in the prison world in ways that it had rarely been visible in Mystic Falls, and Bonnie's strength and her resourcefulness and her refusal to surrender to despair even in circumstances that objectively warranted despair revealed dimensions of her character that the show had been gesturing toward for years without fully exploring. Bonnie carried most of the weight of their eventual escape, her magical abilities, and her understanding of the Bennett grimoires she found in the prison world, providing the technical means by which an exit became theoretically possible, and her emotional labor in maintaining both her own hope and Damon's flagging motivation during the months when escape seemed perpetually one failure away from impossible, providing the human foundation on which the technical effort rested. She sent Damon home first, when the escape finally worked, the decision reflecting both her genuine care for him and the particular selflessness that had characterized Bonnie's role in the story across every season. The pattern of her sacrificing her own safety and her own comfort for the people she loved so thoroughly established that it had become the audience's expectation of her, rather than a choice she was making in any given moment, which was one of the things the show was beginning to examine more critically in its later seasons. Kai's escape came through his merger with his twin brother Luke, the Gemini succession ritual completed not by the Coven's design, but by Kai's manipulation of circumstances that placed him and Luke in proximity at a moment when Kai had sufficient magical power from siphoning to force the merge regardless of Luke's consent or the Coven's authorization. The merge with Luke was supposed to transfer not only magical power, but also something of Luke's character into the dominant twin. The ritual designed with the assumption that the stronger twin's survival would be tempered by absorption of the weaker twin's qualities in ways that would produce a leader who was both powerful and balanced. What emerged from Kai's merge with Luke was Kai with access to genuine Gemini magic and with something that resembled but wasn't quite equivalent to Luke's empathy. A partial conscience grafted onto a psychology that had been formed without one, producing a version of Kai who occasionally surprised himself and others with moments of what appeared to be genuine feeling, but who remained fundamentally capable of the same calculations and the same cruelty that had defined him before the merge, now simply occasionally troubled by them in ways he had not been before. His attack on Joe Laughlin and Alaric Saltzman's wedding represented his most devastating single act in the show's present timeline. The targeting of a celebration and of people who had found genuine happiness together in a story that did not always make happiness easy to maintain or easy to protect. Jo was a Gemini twin herself, a doctor whose relationship with Alaric had been one of the show's gentlest and most human storylines in seasons that had been heavy with supernatural consequence, and she was pregnant with twins whose existence represented both the continuation of the Gemini line and the specific hope that she and Alaric had been building toward together. Kai killed her at the altar with magic that was precise and was deliberate, and that was designed to inflict maximum damage on the maximum number of people he had decided deserved to suffer for the ways the Coven had treated him. The attack, framed as justice in his own psychology and visible to everyone else as what it actually was. The act of someone who had confused punishment with power and revenge with resolution. The sleeping curse Kai placed on Elena before his own death was constructed with the specific cruelty of someone who understood exactly which relationships to target to cause the most lasting pain. The enchantment linking Elena's consciousness to Bonnie's life in a way that meant Elena would sleep in a magical coma for as long as Bonnie lived, waking only when Bonnie died, naturally or otherwise. The elegance of the construction was genuinely terrible. It did not kill Elena, which would have been simpler and less painful for the people who loved her, but instead converted her continued existence into a countdown and converted every year of Bonnie's life into a year of Eleanor's sleep, making the two women's survival mutually exclusive in a way that forced everyone who loved both of them to live permanently in the tension between wanting Bonnie to live as long as possible and knowing that Bonnie's longevity was the direct cost of Elena's absence. Damon lost Elena. Bonnie lost her best friend. The friendship that had been the emotional center of the show since its first episode was placed under an impossible constraint that neither woman had chosen, and that neither could resolve through any action available to them. The curse's particular genius being that it weaponized love rather than simply causing pain, and that the people it hurt most were the ones who deserved it least. The world that the show inhabited in its 6th and 7th seasons had been reshaped by the accumulation of everything that had come before it. The supernatural landscape of Mystic Falls and its surroundings carrying the sediment of 6 years of conflict and loss and transformation that had changed every character in ways both visible and internal, and that had made the town itself feel like a place that had been through something rather than simply a setting in which things happened. The heretics arrived into this world as the primary antagonists of the 7th season, with a backstory that connected them to established mythology while introducing genuinely new complications. Their nature as siphoner witches who had been turned vampire, giving them a combination of abilities that should not have been possible within the rules the show had established about what vampires were and were not capable of, and that required a specific origin story to explain how the impossible had been achieved and what it meant for everyone who now had to exist in proximity to it. Lily Salvatore was the thread that connected the heretics to the story's established emotional core. Her identity as Stefan and Damon's mother, providing the personal stakes that prevented the 7th season's antagonists from being simply external threats, and instead made them an extension of the unfinished business that the Salvatore brothers had been carrying about their family of origin across 160 years of existence. She had died of consumption when her sons were still human, or had appeared to die. The reality being that she had completed her vampire transition in the morgue after her family had already begun grieving her, and that the combination of her shame about what she had become and her addiction to human blood had driven her into behaviors and into a disappearance that her sons had interpreted as abandonment rather than as the complicated truth of a woman who had lost control of herself in the most fundamental way available to a vampire and who had not known how to return. She had found the heretics in a prison world of their own. A different pocket dimension from Kai's 1994, this one set in 1893. Where the Gemini Coven had sent them for the same reasons it sent anyone to a prison world, because they were too dangerous to be permitted to exist freely in the world, and too connected to people the Coven valued to be simply eliminated. The heretics were 6 in number: Valerie, Nora, Mary Louise, Beau, Malcolm, and Oscar. Each of them carrying the particular psychological complexity of people who had been genuinely monstrous and who had also been genuinely abandoned. Their loyalty to Lily absolute in the way that loyalty becomes absolute when someone is the only person who has ever treated you as a person, rather than as a problem requiring containment or elimination. Valerie carried an additional connection to the story's history through her relationship with Stefan in 1863, a relationship that Klaus had deliberately destroyed through violence that had consequences neither Stefan nor Valerie had known about until the seventh season revealed them. The revelation adding another layer to the understanding of how thoroughly Klaus's manipulations had reached into every corner of the lives of the people around him, even when those people had believed themselves to be safely outside his orbit. The occupation of Mystic Falls by the heretics following Lily's release represented one of the most literally disruptive events in the show's run. The evacuation of the entire town, transforming a place that had been the story's permanent anchor into an absence. The supernatural community displaced into the surrounding area, while the heretics established themselves in the homes and the spaces that the town's residents had been forced to leave behind. The occupation was not simply a tactical move, but was an expression of the heretics' particular psychology, their occupation of human spaces and human lives reflecting the same hunger for normalcy that had driven Rebecca across 1,000 years and that existed in anyone who had been told for long enough that they did not deserve the ordinary things that ordinary people took for granted. The town without its people had a specific quality of wrongness that the show rendered effectively. The familiar streets and familiar buildings carrying the uncanny quality of things that should be inhabited and are not. The absence of human life making the supernatural presence more visible and more disturbing than it was when it existed in contrast to the human world, rather than in replacement of it. Stefan's relationship with Valerie reopened questions about his history and his past choices that his relationship with Elena and his relationship with Caroline had not required him to examine. The revelation of what had been taken from both of them by Klaus's intervention, arriving in a season that was already concerned with what people owed each other across the long arcs of their histories and what counted as resolution for damage that could not be undone. Caroline's relationship with Stefan had been developing across the 5th and 6th seasons with a particular quality of a connection that had been built on genuine friendship and genuine mutual understanding before it became romantic, the foundation more durable than many of the story's other romantic foundations, precisely because it had not begun in attraction and had not required the removal of ordinary knowledge about who the other person actually was. Julian was introduced as the complicating factor in whatever reconciliation might have been possible between Lily and her sons. His relationship with Lily, carrying the specific danger of someone whose love for a person expressed itself through possession and through the elimination of anything that threatened his centrality to that person's existence. He was violent with the particular confidence of someone who had been violent for long enough that it had become simply how he operated rather than something he chose in specific circumstances. His treatment of the people around him reflecting an understanding of power as the only meaningful currency in supernatural social dynamics, and his treatment of Lily reflecting the specific way that some people love, completely and destructively, and without the capacity to distinguish between devotion and control. His death was necessary and was achieved through the combined effort of the siblings whose relationship with their mother had been permanently complicated by his presence, and Lily's grief following his death led to her own death in circumstances that closed the possibility of the reconciliation that Stefan in particular had wanted, and that the season had been building toward with the slow patience of a storyline that understood it needed to earn the emotional weight it was asking the audience to carry. The sirens Sybil and Celine represented the show's most ambitious mythological expansion in its later seasons. Their nature as ancient psychic creatures who fed on human flesh and on human souls, introducing a cosmology that connected the story's supernatural world to questions about what happened to souls after death and whether the afterlife was a single destination or a landscape of competing claims that different supernatural forces exercised over different categories of the dead. Sybil was the elder and the more immediately dangerous. Her ability to rewrite memories and to access minds, directly making her a threat that operated in the register of identity rather than simply physical danger. The horror of her power being that she could make you into someone else from the inside without leaving visible marks on the outside that would tell the people who loved you that the person they were interacting with had been altered. Celine was softer in presentation and proved in practice to be no less dangerous. Her manipulation of Alaric's twins, Josie and Lizzie, demonstrating a particular form of cruelty that targeted children and that made the season's threat feel more personal and more visceral than threats directed at adult characters who had at least chosen to be in proximity to the supernatural world. Cade was the entity that Sybil and Celine served. His origin, the show's most direct engagement with the concept of a created hell dimension, and with the question of whether evil on a sufficient scale could generate its own metaphysical consequences. He had been a psychic of extraordinary power in his human life, killed by a mob that feared what he was, and whose death had been violent and had been public and had been witnessed by enough people with enough emotional intensity to leave an imprint on the fabric of the supernatural world that had calcified over centuries into its own dimension. A hell of one man's making that had then become the destination of souls whose actions in life had made them appropriate for what Cade's dimension offered, which was not peace and was not rest and was not the continuation of anything that had existed in the life before it. The theology was deliberately incomplete in the way that the show's engagement with afterlife questions had always been deliberately incomplete, offering enough specificity to generate genuine stakes without committing to a cosmology so defined that it would constrain the story's future options or require it to answer questions it did not want to answer definitively. Stefan and Damon, under Cade's control, represented the season's most psychologically complex material. The brothers' souls effectively bargained away through a sequence of events that left them serving Cade's interests in the living world, while their own values and their own relationships were progressively eroded by the obligations the service required. The version of Damon who operated under Cade's influence was not a different person from the Damon who had spent the previous seasons moving towards something resembling genuine goodness, but was rather that same person making the opposite choice at every decision point. The familiar face and the familiar wit applied to purposes that inverted everything his development had been building toward. The regression functioning as both plot engine and as the show's most direct examination of how fragile the progress of a person's moral development actually is when the circumstances that supported it are systematically removed. Caroline and Alaric's co-parenting arrangement around Josie and Lizzie occupied the gentler and more human register of the 7th and 8th seasons. the twins who had survived Joe's death, by being magically transferred into Caroline's body during the wedding attack, growing into young children whose existence represented both the grief of their biological mother's death and the unexpected grace of Alaric finding himself a father to children who needed him in ways that nothing else in his supernatural adjacent life had needed him. Caroline's relationship with the twins and with Alaric developed the complexity of a family structure that did not fit any conventional template. Not romantic partnership, not simply co-parenting, but something more thoroughly entangled than either of those categories fully captured. Two people building something together out of necessity and shared love for two small girls who deserved better than to grow up in the shadow of their origin story, and who were given, through Alaric's devotion and Caroline's warmth and the extended family that surrounded them, something that resembled the better that they deserved. The town of Mystic Falls recovered from its occupation and returned to the version of its normal that it had always maintained. The supernatural present and the human community continuing alongside it, in the uneasy coexistence that the founding families had established, and that each generation had maintained through varying combinations of knowledge and denial, and the deliberate choice to continue living in a place that asked more of its residents than most places ask simply because of what was buried in its history, and what continued to surface through that history into the present. The Salvatore brothers returned to it as they always had, shaped differently by what had happened to them and carrying different things than they had carried when they had last been simply present in the town, without serving something larger or fighting something that threatened everything they had built there. The returns always partial, recoveries and always incomplete restorations of whatever had existed before the latest crisis had required everything of everyone and taken more than had been given back. The 8th and final season of the Vampire Diaries was built around the question that the show had been circling since its first episode without ever asking it quite directly. Whether the damage that people carry from the worst things they have done and the worst things that have been done to them can be repaired sufficiently to constitute genuine redemption, or whether some accumulations of harm are simply too large and too permanent to be resolved by anything except the most complete and the most irreversible form of atonement available to the person who carries them, and who has finally decided that carrying them indefinitely is no longer something they are willing to do. The season assembled its final conflicts with the deliberateness of a story that understood it was closing and that wanted to ensure that every significant thread had been followed to its honest conclusion, rather than simply tied off for the sake of a clean ending that would have satisfied the surface requirements of closure without earning the emotional weight that 8 seasons of investment had created in the people who had been watching and who had given the story enough of themselves to deserve an ending that was honest about what everything had cost and what it had produced. The world that the final season inhabited was one shaped by the accumulated consequences of everything that had preceded it. The supernatural landscape of Mystic Falls, bearing the marks of every crisis and every loss and every transformation that had passed through it across 8 years of story, in ways that made the town itself feel like a participant in the narrative rather than simply a setting. Its streets and its buildings and its founding family histories all carrying the sediment of what had happened there and what continued to happen there, because The convergence of supernatural power in that particular piece of Virginia soil had never dissipated and had never stopped drawing to itself the kinds of events and the kinds of people whose stories required exactly this kind of charged and consequence-laden ground to unfold upon. Cade's destruction came through the combined effort of the people who had spent the season working to free Stefan and Damon from his influence and to dismantle the hell dimension he had built over centuries of accumulating the souls of the damned into a power that had begun to extend its reach into the living world in ways that made it a threat not simply to specific individuals, but to the broader balance between the supernatural and the human that Mystic Falls had maintained in its imperfect and costly way across the generations since the founding families had first decided that maintenance was preferable to surrender. The Maxwell Bell was the instrument of his destruction, its creation embedded in the town's founding family history in the way that so many of the story's most significant objects were embedded, not imported from outside the story's world, but grown from the specific soil of Mystic Falls and from the specific histories of the families who had lived there long enough to become part of the town's supernatural infrastructure, whether they had intended that incorporation or not. Peter Maxwell's role in the Bell's forging connected the show's final season to its deepest historical roots, the founding family's knowledge and their legacy proving relevant one final time in the resolution of a threat that had arrived from a direction none of them could have anticipated, but that required exactly the kind of inherited supernatural knowledge that those families had spent generations maintaining, against the possibility of precisely this kind of need. Cade's death removed the immediate supernatural threat, but created the vacancy that Catherine Pierce moved into, with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity and who had spent 500 years developing the instinct for recognizing moments when the landscape shifted in ways that could be exploited by someone sufficiently prepared and sufficiently motivated to move quickly before anyone else recognized what was available. Her assumption of Hell's governance following Cade's destruction was entirely consistent with her character across the entirety of her story. Wherever there was power unclaimed and wherever there was chaos that could be shaped into advantage by someone with her particular combination of intelligence and ruthlessness and complete freedom from the moral constraints that limited other people's responses to opportunity, Catherine Pierce would find her way into the center of it and would make whatever was available work in her favor with the thoroughness that 500 years of survival had refined into something approaching an art form. Stefan took the cure from his own veins in the aftermath of Cade's destruction, the decision representing the culmination of an arc that had been building across the entire series around the question of what Stefan Salvatore actually wanted, when the wanting was not obscured by crisis or by the needs of the people around him, or by the various forms of self-punishment that he had practiced across 160 years of vampire existence that had given him more than sufficient opportunity to confuse suffering with penance and to mistake the continuation of his own pain for meaningful atonement for the harm he had caused. He had wanted to be human again, with a consistency and a sincerity that distinguished his desire from the performed nostalgia that some of the show's other characters expressed about their human lives. The wanting genuine in him because his humanity had been taken rather than chosen, and because the person he had been before 1864 had been someone he had genuinely liked and had genuinely wanted to continue becoming, before the transformation had redirected everything into the particular channels that vampire existence carved for itself through the people it inhabited. The experience of being human again even briefly revealed that the person he had been was still available to him beneath everything that vampirism and its associated centuries of violence and grief and periodic devastating failure had layered on top of it. The Stefan who felt his heart beating and his body's warmth and the ordinary physical sensations of mortality responding to those sensations not with alienation, but with recognition, as though the human self had simply been waiting with the patience of something that understands it, has nowhere else to go for the vampire existence to finally exhaust itself and make room for the return that had always been the destination, even when the path to it had been obscured by everything that had to happen first. The cure transferred to Damon during Stefan's sacrifice was the act that reordered the moral accounting of everything the show had established about the brothers' relationship across 8 seasons. The older brother, who had spent 160 years making his younger brother's existence more difficult, finally receiving from that younger brother the one gift that Stefan had any right to give, and that Damon had never asked for explicitly, and had perhaps never fully believed he deserved, in the way that people who have spent long enough telling a story about their own unworthiness eventually lose the ability to imagine the story ending differently. Damon had spent the entire final season moving towards something that resembled genuine readiness for the humanity he had been circling for 8 years. The combination of Elena's absence and Bonnie's friendship and Stefan's persistent belief in him and his own exhaustion with the version of himself that perpetual cynicism produced, having brought him to a place where the cure felt less like a gift imposed from outside and more like the completion of a process that had been underway for longer than he had been willing to acknowledge. Stefan chose Damon's humanity over his own, with the simplicity of a decision that does not require deliberation, because the answer has been known for a long time. And the only remaining question was when the moment would arrive that made the answer actionable. Catherine's plan to destroy Mystic Falls through hellfire was constructed with the specific logic of someone who had decided that if she could not have what she had spent 500 years pursuing, then the pursuit itself would be interrupted as completely and as permanently as possible. The hellfire representing not a tactical objective with achievable goals beyond the destruction itself, but a statement about what Catherine Pierce thought of a world that had repeatedly refused to simply let her have the ordinary life that everyone else in the story had been permitted to pursue across the same years, that she had been running and hiding and surviving through methods that had cost her everything she had originally wanted and had left her with only the survival itself, which was considerable and was hard-won, and was ultimately insufficient as a life's entire content. The targeting of Mystic Falls was personal in the way that everything Catherine did was personal. The town representing the place where her running had finally ended, and where the people she had used and manipulated across 5 centuries had built exactly the kind of lives she had originally wanted and had never been permitted to have. The sight of other people's ordinary happiness functioning for Catherine as the most effective form of torment that her particular psychology could produce. The hellfire was redirected through the tunnels beneath Mystic Falls. The underground passages that had served the town's supernatural history in various capacities since the founding families had built them, and that now served their final and most significant purpose in containing and redirecting a supernatural force that would otherwise have consumed everything above them. Stefan entered the tunnels human, the cure in his blood and his mortality fully restored, and he moved through them with the particular quality of motion that belongs to people who have made their final decision and who are therefore freed from the weight of uncertainty that attends every other kind of movement. The deliberateness of his steps, not the deliberateness of someone forcing themselves towards something they fear, but the deliberateness of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has accepted what it means to arrive there. Caroline was channeling the hellfire through the Bennett Witch connection outside the tunnels. Bonnie's power and the power of the Bennett ancestral line providing the magical framework through which fire that had been gathering force in a hell dimension for centuries could be redirected into something that consumed only what it was directed at, rather than everything in its path. The spell requiring Bonnie to reach deeper into her power than she had reached since the moments when reaching that deep had cost her everything, and that now asked the same depth for a different kind of cost. Catherine's dissolution in the hellfire was the end of 500 years of running and surviving and performing and calculating, and occasionally, beneath all of that, wanting something simpler than what her life had become and being unable to find her way back to the simplicity from inside the labyrinth that survival had built around her over the centuries. She died as she had lived, still making statements, still refusing to be simply defeated when she could be defeated with style. Still Catherine Pierce in her final moment, in the way that some people remain entirely themselves all the way to the end, regardless of what the end requires of them. The hell dimension dissolved with her. The souls it had been holding released into whatever came after that particular form of containment. The dissolution representing not simply the end of a villain, but the resolution of a supernatural wound that had been open since Cade's violent death had created it, and that had been pulling darkness toward Mystic Falls with the patient gravity of something that feeds on exactly the kind of accumulation of supernatural consequence that the town had been generating for over 1,000 years. Stefan's death was human and was quiet in the way that deaths are quiet, when they happen in the aftermath of a decision already made and a peace already found. The violence of the hellfire consumed by the magic that redirected it, and leaving Stefan in the tunnels in the stillness that follows, when something that has been in motion for a very long time finally stops. He had written Caroline a letter before going into the tunnels. The letter a goodbye that was also a declaration and also an instruction to live fully and to build the school she had been planning for supernatural children, and to allow herself the happiness that his death was interrupting but not cancelling, because the happiness was hers independently of his presence and was available to her in a future that he could see clearly even from where he was standing, and that he wanted for her with the specific quality of love that wishes for the beloved's flourishing rather than the beloved's grief. The letter was the last thing Stefan Salvatore ever wrote, and it was entirely characteristic of him, practical and loving, and more concerned with the person receiving it than with the person who was writing it at the end of his life in the tunnels beneath the town. where his human life had been spent and ended, and where his vampire existence had returned him one final time. Elena woke when Bonnie broke the sleeping curse through access to a depth of Bennett power that Bonnie had been building toward across her entire arc in the series. The accumulation of every sacrifice and every loss, and every moment of choosing other people's survival over her own comfort, having produced in her a magical capacity that exceeded what any individual Bennett witch had possessed in isolation, and that drew on the ancestral line's collective power in ways that the curse's construction had not anticipated and could not withstand. Elena's awakening carried the weight of everything that had been deferred during the time she had slept, and everything that had changed in the world she was returning to. The mystic falls she woke into, not the mystic falls she had left, and the people she woke to not entirely the people they had been when the sleeping curse had separated her from them. Everyone shaped by the years that had passed, and by what those years had required of them, and carrying in themselves the evidence of what surviving without her had cost, and what it had produced. She woke to Damon human, and to Stefan gone, and to a Mystic Falls that had survived its final crisis, in the way that Mystic Falls always survived its crises, damaged and diminished and somehow still standing. The town's persistence less a triumph than a testimony to how much the people who loved it were willing to endure to keep it intact, and to what the generations of founding family descendants and supernatural residents had been building across the centuries when they chose to stay in a place that asked more of its residents than most places ask, and that gave back something that could not be found in safer and quieter locations, but that was worth the cost to the people for whom that particular something was the thing they most needed. Her conversation with Stefan in the space outside of time that the show created for their goodbye honored everything their relationship had been, without pretending it was something other than what it had become across the years of her vampire existence and his, and the various choices and losses and transformations that had moved them from the center of each other's stories to the periphery without diminishing what the center had meant when they had occupied it for each other. Damon and Elena's life together was shown in the flash forwards that closed the series with a specific emotional weight of things that had been promised across 8 seasons and delivered finally in the quietest possible register. The images of their ordinary human existence in Mystic Falls carrying the proof of the show's central argument that the darkness these characters had moved through was not the point of the story, but the obstacle between them and the point, which was simply this: 2 people who had found each other in the worst possible circumstances and under the worst possible conditions, growing old together in a town where they had both nearly died more times than either of them could count. The ordinariness of their ending, the most extraordinary thing the show could have offered after 8 seasons of extraordinary events, the ordinary life the reward rather than the consolation. Bonnie's story ended in the most honest resolution the show offered any of its characters. The freedom she received at the curse's breaking, genuine and unqualified in a way that nothing Bonnie had been given across 8 seasons had been genuinely unqualified. Every previous gift having arrived with a cost attached, or a condition imposed, or a timeline that would eventually require her to sacrifice the gift for someone else's more urgent need. She traveled, and she built a life that was organized around her own desires and her own curiosity, rather than around other people's crises, the joy of it genuine, and the freedom of it genuine, and the show acknowledging through her ending that Bonnie Bennett deserved to be the protagonist of her own story, rather than the instrument of everyone else's, and that the most honest thing it could do for her in the final accounting was to give her a life that asked nothing of her, except that she live it fully and without reservation, and with the same devotion to her own flourishing that she had spent 8 years directing entirely outward toward the people she loved. Caroline's School for Supernatural Children was the practical legacy that transformed the grief and the knowledge and the particular education that Mystic Falls had provided across generations of supernatural residents into something that the next generation could receive deliberately rather than accidentally. The school representing the acknowledgement that growing up with abilities and a nature that the ordinary world could not accommodate deserved preparation and community, and the accumulated wisdom of people who had navigated exactly that experience rather than simply the survival-based improvisation that had been the previous generation's primary resource. Klaus's letter arrived in the timeline that the original spin-off was exploring, its delivery confirming that the connection between him and Caroline had survived his death and her grief, and the years that had separated them, and that the future his letter gestured toward was real, rather than simply romantic speculation. The implication of what came next left open in the way that good stories leave open the things that belong to the imagination, rather than to the page. Stefan's reunion with Lexi existed in whatever space the show had always maintained for the things that came after. Not fully described and not fully explained, but present in the way that the show's treatment of death and the afterlife had always been present. Specific enough to feel real and vague enough to accommodate the mystery that genuine questions about what follows death require in any honest artistic treatment of the subject. The oldest friendship of his vampire existence restored in the moment when his vampire existence ended. The two of them together in the peace that the running had been building toward all along, without either of them knowing that rest, rather than resolution, was where the road ended, and that the ending was not a defeat, but an arrival. So rest now. Vampire Diaries Souls, with the story of Mystic Falls complete. From the grief of a mother who broke the laws of nature on a dark night 1,000 years ago, through the centuries of running and of hunger and of love that refused to stay buried, no matter how many times it was daggered or compelled or sealed beneath the earth, to the quiet, ordinary morning when Damon Salvatore woke human beside the person he had spent 8 seasons and 160 years finding his way back to. This was never simply a story about vampires. It was a story about what people become when the worst possible things happen to them, and when the becoming has no clear endpoint and no guaranteed direction, and no promise that the person emerging from the damage will be recognizable to the person who entered it. It was a story about brothers who destroyed each other and rebuilt each other and destroyed each other again across 160 years of shared history that neither of them could escape, and neither of them fully wanted to escape, because the history, even the painful parts of it, was the evidence that they had mattered to each other, and that mattering, even when it expressed itself through harm, was not nothing, and was not replaceable by anything that existed outside of the specific relationship they had been to each other, since before either of them had any idea what they were going to become. It was a story about Elena Gilbert, who was 17 years old and grieving and keeping a journal in a graveyard when it began, and who was returned to something like peace at its end. The journey between those 2 points costing her parents and her aunt and her uncle and her brother and her humanity and years of her life spent in the sleeping darkness while the world moved without her. The cost extraordinary and the survival of it. More extraordinary still, because Elena Gilbert was not simply a girl who survived things, but a girl who survived things without losing the essential quality of her warmth and her genuine care for the people around her, the empathy intact at the end in ways that the story attested with a comprehensiveness that left no doubt about its durability. It was a story about Bonnie Bennett, who deserved more than she was given for most of the time. The story lasted, and who received at its end the thing she had never been permitted to claim for herself across 8 seasons of giving everything she had to everyone around her. The simple and extraordinary gift of her own life, undivided and unencumbered and pointed entirely in whatever direction she chose to point it. The freedom genuine and the joy of it genuine, and the acknowledgement implicit in the giving of it. That what Bonnie had done across the story's full length was not simply support and not simply sacrifice, but was heroism of the quietest and most costly kind. The kind that does not announce itself and does not ask for recognition, and does not stop even when the stopping would have been entirely justified by everything that the asking had already taken. It was a story about Caroline Forbes, who began as the girl everyone underestimated and ended as the woman who built the school that would ensure the next generation of supernatural children did not have to learn what she had learned the way she had learned it. Alone and afraid, and without anyone who had been through it before to tell her that the fear was survivable, and that what she was becoming was not a diminishment of who she had been, but an expansion of it into something that the girl who had needed everyone's approval in order to feel real could not have imagined, and that the woman who no longer needed anyone's approval in order to act had built out of grief and out of love and out of the particular determination that had always been her most fundamental characteristic, even when it had been directed toward things that were too small for it. It was a story about the Mikkelsen family, who had been the first and who had carried the weight of that firstness across 1,000 years of consequences that their mother's grief had set in motion on a night when she had loved her children more than she had respected the boundaries of the world they lived in, and had paid for that love, and had made everyone else pay for it in ways that compounded across the centuries into a debt so large that no single act of atonement could settle it, and that required instead the slow work of individual people making individual choices across generations that eventually, imperfectly, incompletely, bent the arc of all that accumulated damage towards something that resembled resolution, even if it could never fully resemble repair. It was a story about Mystic Falls itself, the small Virginia town that had been built on a convergence of supernatural power and on the deliberate forgetting of what that power had produced, and on the equally deliberate remembering that certain families had maintained across generations, because they understood that forgetting was not safety, but was simply the accumulation of danger in darkness, where it could grow without being seen or addressed or countered by people who knew what they were dealing with. The town survived because the people who loved it refused to let it be consumed by the things that wanted to consume it. the survival neither clean nor cheap but genuine and continuous and earned again in every generation, by people who could have left and who chose to stay, and who made of that choosing something that looked, from a sufficient distance, like home. The thing that Mystic Falls understood about love, through everything it had witnessed and everything it had survived, was that love in its genuine form was not the feeling, but the decision. The decision to remain present to someone across the full range of what their existence contained, including the darkness and the damage and the periodic catastrophic failure that every person in the story had demonstrated they were capable of when circumstances removed the constraints that kept the darkness manageable. Stefan loved Damon across 160 years of deliberate cruelty, and chose him at the end with a completeness that the cruelty did not negate, and that the love did not excuse, but that together constituted a relationship of such thorough knowledge of each other that the word love was almost too small for what it was actually describing. Damon loved Elena across 8 seasons of almost destroying everything she had built and been given, repeatedly and against all reasonable expectation, the chance to try again and to try better, and to eventually become someone who deserved the chances he had been given, even if he never became someone who stopped needing the grace that made them possible. The dead of Mystic Falls were not forgotten in the story's ending. The people who had not survived the story's full length present in the final accounting through the shapes their absence had carved. In the people who remained and through the choices those remaining people made that bore the mark of what the dead had taught them or had asked of them or had simply been in their lives before they were gone. Jenna Summers, who had shown up for 2 grieving teenagers when showing up, was the only qualification the situation recognized. Lexi Branson, who had believed in Stefan across 160 years of reasons not to. Sheila Bennett, who had spent her power and her life to open a tomb for the sake of her granddaughter's friend, and had died in the spending without regret that the sacrifice documented in her expression in the moment before she fell. Alarix Joe, who had deserved decades more than she was given. Jeremy Gilbert, who had died too, young in a story that had cost everyone more than it should have, and that had asked its youngest members to carry weight that their years had not prepared them for, and that they had carried anyway, with the particular resilience of young people in impossible circumstances who do not yet know they are supposed to find those circumstances impossible. The lesson that Mystic Falls spent 8 seasons teaching was not about vampires, or about witches, or about the supernatural world that existed alongside the human one in that small Virginia town built on ancient convergent power. The lesson was simpler and was older than the Michelson family, and older than the white oak tree, and older than any curse or any magic or any monster that the story had introduced across its full length. The lesson was that the darkness inside people is not the truth of them, but it is also not nothing, and that the work of a life, human or vampire or witch or werewolf, mortal or immortal, shaped by ordinary grief or by supernatural consequence, is the work of learning to hold the darkness honestly without letting it become the only thing that defines what you are and what you are capable of becoming. Some people in the story managed that work, some did not. Most managed it imperfectly, and in the managing produced something that was neither triumph nor failure, but was simply the honest record of a genuine attempt, which is all that any of us can offer, and which is it turns out enough. Sleep now. Let the streets of Mystic Falls grow quiet around you. Let the Salvatore boarding house settle into its old wood and its older memories. Let the Bennett grimoires rest closed on their shelves, and let the founding family histories lie still in their archives, and let the tunnels beneath the town hold their silence, and let everyone who found their way through the darkness find their rest at last. The story of Mystic Falls is complete. The story of the people who loved each other through the worst of what they were and the best of what they became is complete. The candle in the window of the boarding house burns low, and the night is quiet, and the town that carried 1,000 years of consequence in its soil is finally, gently, at peace. Good night.